I'm Callista, and I'm joined by
Madam Adam
and
Huang.
Our topic today is about the differences between the left half and the right half of the brain. The right side of the brain is for creativity and changes in the environment. The right side is very thoughtful and can detect emotional features of people and how they talk. And the left side is more logical and noticing the details with critical thinking and reasoning.
Well, I'm curious because why is there a need to split up those functions in two different sections of the brain? And it seems like the lower animals or the other animals, such as monkey, seem to have similar structure. So there must be some sort of nature's reasons to do that for some kind of optimization.
It's for survival. So the distinction between the two different sides of the brain isn't actually that much. You're not solely a right or a left side, but you can be more dominantly on both sides. So the left side is more noticing the details of the environment, and the right side is for the changes. So if you have the different types of people like that, it'll help you survive.
Do we know, are they structurally different between left and right, or it just as you grow up you store information differently, or is there like an intrinsic differences in the left side and right side structures? Do we know about that?
The physical appearance is the same.
So what you're talking about here, that's an excellent comment, is the actual structure of the brain, which Callista did a really good job on actually dissecting the brain and showing us the parts of the brain. So when she got into the brain looked bilateral, meaning the same on both sides. What now we're talking about, though, is the thinking and the behavior that's coming, the differences in the thinking and the behavior. I like, John, what you said about evolutionary survival potential. I think that's a really good point to think about.
I also saw that usually the left hemisphere is for common and routine tasks. So that's why most people are right-handed, because the right side of the body is controlled by the left hemisphere. And then the right hemisphere responds quickly to dangerous stimuli. So that's why sometimes when you are immediately faced with something dangerous, then you like shield with your left hand.
I think that's a very, very interesting point. One thing that I might add to that, at some point in the past, I was at a very fascinating neuroanatomy discussion, and the presenter of the discussion actually said that depending on which side of the brain, that the areas of the brain that control different functions, though the cortex looks somewhat the same on both sides, different areas control, as you're saying, different things. And actually, the cortical thickening will increase in areas that you use the most. So somebody who, let's say, does a lot of music, their music center will be more thick. And if you do an autopsy on their brain, which is to actually look at their brain after they die, some areas will actually have thickening in that area. For example, someone who plays the piano a lot will have a thicker music layer. The area that controls music will actually become thicker, and you can actually sometimes measure in there and take a guess as to what the person did for a profession for many years, because there will actually be cortical thickening due to dendrite growth, which is the neuron, a part on the neuron.
Going back to earlier, I think we read somewhere before that when the person loses a certain, for example, hearing, then your visual started to enlarge, and then that the area that used to be responsible for hearing started to shrink in its function. So the brain actually can adjust itself, maybe locally, but hemisphere-wise, I'm not sure if there has been study done on switching Like for most people, store on the left side for, like you said, music. But then for some people, they switch to the right for various reasons. So whether the brain itself is a sponge or it's allocated sections for functionalities, I don't know. I don't know, and I wish somebody can answer that.
Because sometimes if somebody is like damaged on one side of the brain, then the function for that side may move to the other side. Or sometimes when your memory is stored somewhere and you zap it with an electrode, the memory can move somewhere else.
Well, I think both of your points are very fascinating and well taken, and something that in doing neural research is something we really have to think about, because the brain is supposed to be more complicated and difficult to understand than all of our universe because of the 100 billion interconnecting neurons that we're trying to study here. So I think, John, your point about wanting to localize and say this area covers this and that area covers that is very well backed up by what Callista just said, because sometimes the brain can compensate in fascinating ways, which is what you were talking about, Callista. And so who is to say what has happened in all of our embryological development, and then after we're born, then we're relating to the environment. So here we're trying to, without knowing basically the whole history of what that brain has been through, say this is the typical brain, when brains are influenced by their environment and what they've been exposed to. So here there are broad generalities I believe we can make safely, and that is the front. If you put your hand on your forehead, that's called what, Callista? Frontal. And if you put the back on the back hand, what do you call that?
Occipital.
Occipital. And if you put your hands in the middle of your head and you hang them down, we call that the
parietal.
Parietal. So these are really good, solid, basic things we can say, yes, this is what's going on. Frontal for higher thinking, occipital for seeing, temporal for hearing. But once we start getting into these tougher areas of saying, we all do this way, then we start getting in really kind of shaky ground. So again, the brain is classed as our greatest frontier. Now there are some very fascinating research studies that have been done where people have had to have brain surgery, and they have agreed to allow doctors to go in with electrodes and zap around inside of there and then try to figure out memory, which is what you were talking about, Callista. But again, that is a brain under trauma. It's a brain with its outer bony covering taken off, and doctors with an exposed cortex with the outer layers, the dura mater, and all the tough outer core covering taken off, and doctors are in there probing into a human brain. The brain is under trauma. So here we're experimenting and trying to figure out in this rare condition of a sick brain, which you're only going to go in there if the person's sick, and then it's under trauma, and now we're trying to do research on a traumatized brain. So how authentic is the discovering from that? So as we look at this, we have to realize it's very challenging to say. Now, we can do an EEG, electroencephalograph, and that's putting electrodes on the outside and watching where the activity occurs and try to say, oh, look, this activity is happening on this part and this part. But this is with electrodes on the outside of the brain.
Average.
So again, our hands become tied because where's our living specimen?
Right. The analogy of that would be working at Best Buy and customers return a defective computer and trying to figure out how a computer works by working at the defective computer.
The defective one.
And,
so,
and then the EEG analogy that would be trying to figure out what's wrong with that computer by listening to the humming sound. It's really pathetic.
So we look at this, and I think
I think just not even close to understanding.
I think, like you're saying, the 1% that we can look at this and say, well, that's why we can know a lot more about what they call gross anatomy, which is to take out a human brain, and we can really dissect it after someone has volunteered their body to be researched on after death, which you can put that on your driver's license if you feel that you would like to do that. But it's no longer working.
Though there's one thing about this, I think, and which probably is to some degree probably correct, is for a lower animal, well, I'm talking about very low, like a little insect or something, they still have central nervous system of some sort. And that, I think we have pretty good understanding now by using the probing method, because it's pretty simple and we can kind of figure it out. But when we talk about brain, somehow there's implicit understanding we're talking about the consciousness. The consciousness is something, it seems pretty hard to understand, because we are not really there yet. Now, does a little grasshopper, do they have conscious? I don't know, honestly, I don't know. We cannot really just ask.
And I'm always humored by the fact that when we see something as obvious as a dog's tail wagging, we like to put our human evaluation on what this means. We think as a human. Now, it could actually not be that it's all that happy. It could be that it's stressed. A cat purrs and meows, and we want to say, oh, it's happy. It could be stressed. So we're the word we're anthropomorphizing. We're making these animals, and we're putting our interpretation. It's very difficult. Even, this is a wonderful thing to think about, is the color pink for you the real same color as pink for me?
Probably not.
Or is pink for me purple for you, and purple for you pink for me? And therefore, because it's a consistent response we always have to that stimuli, I will always say, for example, I have a blue blouse on, so we will all agree in this panel discussion that this is blue. But what is blue for you might not be blue for me or you. We know this is true because some people, when you taste different foods, that's another form of one of the tastes, the sense of taste. Some people love it and some people can't stand it. So there you go, all this variety. So we want to interpret all this from our personal brain, that we're all being consistent here, but this humongous variation between all of us alone, in just taste alone. Why can some people play music so perfectly and the other people can't even tune a guitar? Some people hear differently. So I believe we hear differently, I believe we see differently, taste, smell, and touch differently.
Yeah, that part I just read maybe half a year ago. It's forefront of the psychology study right now. I mean, all these is really forefront now. But the one thing I want to mention is if you saw because we were at NASA before, the Pathfinder, when it landed on Mars, I remember specifically they had the camera, right, to look at the Mars. On the corner of the camera, they physically had a color panel, physically in front of that camera, and it's a circular with like several corridors, and each one is one color, like red, the rainbow color. So the camera is looking at the picture of Mars, and then physically in front of it has that for calibration, because they know that, because once it goes out there, things may happen that they may lose the coloring. So then by physically place a panel in front of the camera on Pathfinder, they can calibrate when the signal comes back.
Wow.
Yeah, it's very interesting.
Isn't
And I didn't. Right. It was very fascinating. They had to do that. Yeah. Wow. Yeah, I thought, wow. And then the NASA people were saying, oh, what you're seeing on the lower right, it's a panel for calibration. So we know what the color is like on Mars.
Really seeing
Yeah.
after it's happened.
Yeah, it's really cool.
Maybe Mars is blue.
Mars is blue.
Yes.
But what we're talking about is actually the visual experience when we grow up. Maybe that color is different. Yeah, that's very interesting.
Yeah.
Okay, so going back a little earlier, I'm just thinking that maybe because the brain itself, a human brain is a product that came about, like one of the last product came about in the evolutionary cycle, and it's designed in a way that to adapt, allow you to adapt, because it takes like, I don't know, 18 years to nurturing before it leaves the parents, right? I mean, that's a long time compared to all the other animals.
Well, actually, it's getting longer because before, like, the kids didn't stay with their parents for that long.
It's getting longer, so that means it's getting more.
We're getting more.
Probably that
nourishment.
means getting more sophisticated
Yeah.
human race. But so the brain itself is, when it's born, it's designed to adapt to its environment. So unlike an ant, that sort of when it's born, it just goes. So it's a little bit easier designed to study that kind of animal because it's almost more predictable one-to-one relationship. But then a brain is, you adapt, so it grows. So different people go a little bit differently. So it's so hard to study because you really kind of have to, when you are studying one that's not being programmed yet, they may not be enough to study on. Like, how you know where the music is if the person doesn't even know music yet? So and then when the music is sort of formed, it's so complex. By the time you want to study, it's kind of hard because it's there already. So it's really hard to study that.
Quick mention I'll make on that is that your brain does a thing called pruning out, and when
if you don't use it, you'll lose it.
Exactly. So literally, if you, some people have a condition called lazy eye. It's a very common condition actually, where it's a muscle problem in the eye, and so the eye will wander up, and either up to the left or up to the right, and when it wanders off, they're actually not using the eye. They're only using one of their two eyes. So the eye is up like on a clock. It looks like it's looking at about 10 o'clock. It's up, let's say it's at 45-degree angle, either to the right or the left, starting like at a circle. So when it's up there, they are literally not using that eye. They're only using the one eye that's looking forward. So if you do not patch the good eye and force the lazy eye, that's the name of the syndrome, if you don't force the lazy eye to come around, the person actually does have muscle control over it and can bring the eye back. After a period of time, the person will go blind. They will actually go blind in the lazy eye if it goes untreated because of pruning, because the eye's not being used. And then the brain goes in. I'm going to sort of talk for the brain. And the brain is saying, well, we're not using this in the occipital lobe. Well, we're never using this.
Nutrients.
So let's just, and this is an interesting idea, let's just take out those cells because we need to use the cells that we need to use for our survival. And right now, these are not being used. So the way I look at it is the brain is always deciding, let's use the things for our survival. This is a Darwinian survival idea. Let's put all of our energy on what makes us survive. That's the basis of Darwin. And so here, if you have this eye, but you have all these neurons in the back, more or less dedicated to the use of that eye, well, let's just take all those neurons out, and it will allow more dendrites to grow and be functioning somewhere else that can help us survive. So that's like your point here, is if you're never exposed to music, you could have been born a Bach or a Beethoven. And eventually, your brain will just go in and prune out the cells. Mm-hmm. Yet, again, we have to be careful here, because if the brain does work holographically, like we were saying, other parts of the brain can pick up and begin to kick in when some parts are damaged. Other parts will kick in, and then that's when you're actually like retrained to walk. If you lose certain motor areas or something, your other parts can kick in. But that's a fascinating area, and exactly who knows the history of the person you're studying and what their entire life, how it has shaped what brain they come in and you begin to do research on. It has to do with their entire environment, which just exponentially
It's complicated, yeah.
the study.
Plus the timing. I mean, it's just,
It's so huge.
Yeah.
That's why they say it's the greatest of all frontiers.
Yeah.
Well, I would like to thank you for an extremely fascinating talk. I enjoyed it thoroughly, and Callista, I hope you always continue to do research on neuroanatomy and neurofunctioning. And John, it was a pleasure to talk with you.
Thank you, Madam Allen. It was very informative. The brain is a very complex organ, and I look forward to hearing more information from Callista about this.
I too.
Thank you for joining me, and use your brains, people.